Welcome to the fourth GARS Online Panel discussion. This one is on air cargo. The title is COVID-19 and Trade War Boom or Bust Situation for Air Cargo. And we have an exquisite panel and we have Lange from the University of Luxembourg. We have Pearce from IATA. We have Cliff Sullivan from the former chairman of the Hong Kong of HAFFA, the Hong Kong Air Freight and Logistics Association, Air Freight Forward and Logistics Association. We have Alvin Tay from the Atlas Air. And I would ask you, all the participants except the panelists, to switch off your video and mute your mic. And we have a tradition, actually, it's a fourth GARS Online Panel discussion, but still already we have a tradition. And the tradition is that we have a very active participation of the audience via the chat box. So I would strongly encourage you to just, whenever you're having a question, you just ask your question via the chat box. I will read the question and then we'll forward the question to the panelists so that we can address it. Okay, my name is Achim Czerny, and so I think we immediately start with the panel discussion, starting with Pearce's presentation on how the air cargo business is, the state of the air cargo business right now. And so thank you very much, Brian. You are attending actually all the GARS Online Panel discussions. This is fabulous because, of course, what you are having. You are the best person, so to say, to set the scene, and so that we can have a very well-founded discussion afterwards. So thank you very much, Brian, for joining, and please go ahead with your presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, Achim, and good morning to those of you in Europe, and good afternoon, good evening to those of you in Asia. As Achim said, that the purpose of this is really to set the scene, to provide some data as how we see the air cargo business and air cargo markets developing. I guess the first point is to look at the typical output measure in air cargo, which is cargo tonne kilometers flown, and as you can see, we've seen a precipitous drop in 2020, down 28% to the last figures here are April 2020, so down 28% against April last year, and really, against most months last year. As you can see from that chart, cargo was in a bit of a the doldrums. I mean, it was down from where it was in 2018. That was the effect of the trade war, which of course is also part of this conversation today. So 28% fall in volumes. How does that compare to the global financial crisis when, if you remember, trade credit dried up? We saw a 23% drop then. So a little bit more than the downturn in the global financial crisis, which was also a record. Before I leave this chart, I just would like to sort of observe that this is a funny old measure of output if you're an economist, measuring something by weight and by the distance flown. And what we do know is on this measure, air cargo represents probably less than 1% of international trade. And often, international bodies, governments dismiss air transport as an important part of the trading world, which of course is completely wrong. If you look at the value, it's it's a third, 35%, and the products that are carried by air are typically high value, low weight, obviously e-commerce, but all the other products that typically go by air. They also are getting lighter. This has been happening over time. Products have been getting a lot lighter. So this measure of output, almost certainly underestimates the growth in the value of air cargo in economic terms. But clearly, the main point from this is there's been a big shock because of the COVID-19 crisis. But actually, if you compare what's happened to cargo to the passenger business, it's by no means as big a shock as the air passenger business has suffered. As you can see here, you know, the output measure for the passenger business is revenue passenger kilometers flown, and that is almost down to zero. Basically, the industry, certainly internationally, in April, RPKs were 98% down on the year. You know, the industry has been, the passenger part of the industry has been grounded, and that's had some important knock-on effects to the cargo business, because typically half of air cargo, at least by weight, is carried in the bellies of passenger aircraft. But of course, the question is, you know, why hasn't cargo activity fallen? Why hasn't cargo been grounded? Well, one obvious point is that cargo flights are typically not a vector for importing COVID-19. Obviously, cargo crews are subject to tight regulations, but obviously the boxes and the cargo themselves are not a vector for disease. So that's obviously the one point. I guess the second point is that there's been, you know, even in lockdown conditions, there's been a strong demand for medical supplies. And air cargo has been a really important service to transport medical equipment, you know, PPE, but also pharmaceuticals. So we don't have numbers for medical equipment. We do have numbers for pharmaceuticals. And as you can see, you know, since the beginning of the year, they've doubled in terms of the tonnage of pharmaceuticals flown, as opposed to the contraction in other goods. So there's pharmaceuticals, there's medical supplies, but also it's the supply chain role of cargo as well, and you know, increasingly its role in e-commerce, in providing the rapid services that consumers need. And we've all used these services increasingly over the last couple of months. What I think you can also see from this chart is that there's certainly in the first few months of the COVID-19 crisis, we saw ocean trade suffering to a similar extent to air cargo. But if you look at the measure of overall international trade, all modes, actually it's only to March, it's only down about 5%. Compared to a year ago. Air cargo in March was down 15%. So, I mean, clearly there's been a switch in the mode of transport towards land during the first few months of the crisis. What else has been happening? If you look at all the regions, you know, they have been all badly affected, and you know, March in particular was the difficult month. If we had April numbers on these, they'd be down even more. Remember, overall April was down 28%. But there is an outlier here, and that's the Chinese domestic market. Obviously, China entered the crisis earlier and got out earlier. What we're seeing, I think, is cargo here reflecting the return to work in the Chinese economy. I should note, there are some distortions there with the Chinese New Year, but we're also seeing the impact of the rise of the manufacturing sector and the trade that's generating internally, as well as the e-commerce flows that we're seeing as well. I think one of the other really interesting features is that if you're in the freighter business, you know, what crisis, what recession? The freighter business has been booming in the last few months. As you can see, the tonnage of cargo, or cargo ton kilometers flown within Asia, were up sort of 40-50% on the year. in March. And, that's replicated not quite as robustly, but, most regions were seeing strong growth in the cargo carried by freighters. Freighters were in high demand, in contrast to the falls that we've seen in the cargo carried in the bellies of passenger aircraft, which has obviously been due to the grounding of those aircraft. And that chart would be even more extreme in April, where we saw passenger capacity down 80%, 87% in total. But freighters in short supply, and if we look at the capacity, usage of freighters versus passenger aircraft belly capacity, you can see a similar picture there. But what it does show is that the grounding of the passenger fleet, despite the best efforts of the freighters, those increases in available cargo tonne kilometers to be flown in the freighters, represents increased utilization of those freighter aircraft rather than a lot more freighter aircraft arriving. But the grounding of the passenger fleet has shrunk overall capacity, as you can see. Particularly within Asia, you can see overall capacity down almost 40%, despite that big increase in the utilization of freighters. So there's what we're seeing in the cargo business is a capacity crunch in extraordinary contrast to the passenger business. And overall, you can see what's happened here. That yes, there has been a fall in the traffic, the cargo tonne kilometers flown, but capacity has fallen a lot more than that because of the passenger fleet. So given the available capacity, there's actually excess demand at the moment. And that's the reason that you've seen a big increase in the rates, in the price for air cargo services, because there just hasn't been the capacity to serve the available demand. So on many trade lanes, you've seen rates up sort of 2-3 times. And actually, cargo revenues for airlines have been growing. Despite that fall in volumes, the rise in rates has more than offset that. It's been a strong area in the midst of the recession that we've seen elsewhere. Is this going to continue? I guess that's the key question. And I just wanted to show here, one of the features of the air cargo business. So this line here shows the ratio of cargo tonne kilometers to the volume of international trade. Essentially, it's the market share in modes of transport of air cargo. As you can see, over a multi-year period, it's fairly stable at 1. Air cargo actually, typically holds its share over time, but you can see the big cycles, and the bars show the recession periods in the world. And as you can see, typically at the start of a recession, we see a big fall in the share of air cargo. We know that shipping things by air is much more expensive than putting them on a container ship or on a train or by road, which obviously takes a lot longer, but is cheaper. So at the start of a recession, where businesses don't need the speed to get products to market so quickly, you typically see this big fall, as we've seen in the experience that we've had over the last few months. It's actually the business inventory cycle here that is driving these cycles. But as you can see, once that recession ends, as we have a return to work, as the economy starts to pick up, businesses find themselves short of components. And remember that international trade today, 50% of international trade today is in components, not finished goods. and that reflects the fragmentation of the manufacturing supply chain we've seen in recent decades, the globalization, the establishment of global value chains, global supply chains, which is why most of this cross-border trade is in the components that then get assembled and around the world. At the start of the upturn, those assembly plants find themselves short of components. A lot of them are run just-in-time manufacturing, etc. And so there's typically a big surge in air cargo at the beginning of an upturn, which of course is what we're probably just about to go into unless we see a second phase, a second round of COVID-19. We're seeing economies beginning to be unlocked. So I would expect to see actually air cargo demand rising quite significantly in the restart recovery period. As you can see here, that should mean pretty strong growth. So I guess the question is on supply-demand conditions. If the passenger fleet, by contrast, is returning fairly slowly, we might actually see cargo supply-demand conditions staying fairly tight. So that probably means that cargo revenues are going to stay pretty strong, I think. And this chart here shows the share of cargo revenues in total airline industry operating revenues. And you can see the downward trend over the last couple of decades as the cargo business got relatively less important in the airline business. I think that's going to change. It's certainly changed today, and I would expect it's certainly got a few years in it where before the crisis, cargo was 15% of total revenues. Probably going to be about 25% of airline revenues this year and next. And so actually a much more important part of the airline business than it has been in the past. And if I can just finish by saying air cargo is also critically important for the global economy and for the recovery. This chart here shows the number of flights that are taking place. Most of those that are remaining in May, 1st of May this year, are probably cargo flights serving e-commerce, serving those global supply chains, shipping medical supplies around. And in the economics world, when we're or the policy world, where we're assessing airport developments or policies affecting air cargo, typically the tool of choice is cost-benefit analysis. And what we don't take into account are the wider economic benefits of the efficiencies from global supply chains. We really don't take into account the gains from trade and the ability to site assembly and manufacturing facilities, the cheapest places around the world. The direct benefits to the shippers are included in those cost-benefit assessments, but not the wider benefits and the benefits of the sort of industrial or business clusters and hubs that are formed as well. So I guess sort of my final point is that for those academics out there, those researchers out there, there's a real shortage of good evidence on the wider economic benefits to the business sector and to trade. Actually, there's more evidence in the trade literature than the transport economics literature. That's certainly something I think that, and the world as it comes into the recovery phase, I think is going to really need good air transport services to help kickstart, get that trade going, get those inventories rebuilt in order to generate that economic recovery. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Brian. I mean, I really love the presentation because it does clearly show how different the different parts of the aviation industry respond to the current pandemic, and how important it is actually to have a separate discussion on cargo. Because the cargo business, although of course they are interrelated, but still they are, you know, the effects can be very different from each other. And I think that was a very clear message of your presentation. I think that was excellent. And overall, I think it was interesting to see that the kind of picture that you painted of the air cargo business was quite positive. In the short run, you have these spikes in the freight rates, but then even in the longer run, and I think that's something that it would be worthwhile discussing, because there are some studies, for instance, from the World Economic, some studies from the World Bank, sort of indicating that global value chains in importance sort of are kind of decreasing perhaps. And then the question is whether now with the pandemic, global value chains will be further reduced, which would then perhaps also limit a little bit the importance of the air cargo, or have a negative effect on the importance or on the development of the air cargo businesses in the future. So I think that is definitely something that would be nice to discuss throughout the whole this panel discussion. You definitely mentioned while we are having a lot of discussion usually about combined airlines, you highlighted the importance also of all freighters. And we are glad to have Alvin Tay here, who is the representative of the all freighter industry, all cargo airlines, and this is Atlas Air. So maybe you could explain to us a little bit what Atlas Air is doing and how you're experiencing the current situation.
Thanks, Achim. Okay, I think what I'll do is to start with an introduction to Atlas Air Worldwide. So we are actually listed on the NASDAQ, based in New York. And for last year, when we actually generated a revenue of 2.7 billion. And what we do, we are in the aviation outsourcing solution business. So we do wet lease or dry lease. So when we come to wet lease, what we mean is that we provide the aircraft, the crew, maintenance, as well as insurance. Right? Or we can do another option, what we call a CMI, which is crew, maintenance, and insurance. So the aircraft belongs to the customer. And of course, we do charter operation. And we are currently, based on the first quarter of 2020, we operate a fleet of 115 aircraft. We are the largest operator of the 747 aircraft, including the 4 that we fly for Boeing. If you see a nice big aircraft that was custom built for carrying the Dreamlifter parts, we are flying that for Boeing. And we work across the whole supply chain. We work with the shippers. So we, as I mentioned, Boeing, we fly for Amazon in the States. We of course work with the freight forwarders, so the likes of DGF, DSV, KNIGA. We also work with airlines. We have Asiana, NCA, Qantas Freight, just to name a few. And of course, we work with the integrator, so FedEx and UPS. And actually, one of our joint venture partner, we have a subsidiary known as Polar Air, that is actually a joint venture with DHL Express. Okay, so if you look at last year, we flew to more than 400 airports in 90 countries. So I'll just follow on what Brian mentioned about the huge impact of COVID-19 and the role that the freighter played. So actually, even before this pandemic, I would say that the freighter has a very, very unique mission. Because if you look at the passenger belly hold, it's a big part of the capacity, more than 50%, right? As Brian mentioned. But they come with a certain timing. So for example, most passengers would not like to fly in the middle of the night. They don't like to take off at 2 a.m. But if you look at, in terms of the express operator, the likes of DHL, FedEx, UPS, at the hub, it's the busiest from 12 midnight to maybe 4, 5 a.m. Things fly in and get out. And what sort of aircraft actually fulfill that mission? The freighters, large and small. And if you look at actually during the pandemic, the role of a freighter became even more important. That was what, especially in the initial stage, what got shipments flying. The PPEs, first from elsewhere into China, eventually when China started producing again, and and it was from China out into the rest of the world. And of course, the part about the capacity reduction, if you look at, it's not evenly distributed across the world. Right? When more than 95% of the capacity was cut, it was initially felt everywhere. But if you look at the end of May, that's based on the data from Seabury as well as Flight Radar. Actually, on the Transpac eastbound from Asia back to the States, it was marginally up about 4-5% as at end of May. But of course, if you look at transatlantic, where a lot of the capacity has always been fulfilled by the belly hold the flights, it was still down by more than 60%. So it's not evenly distributed. If you look at from Asia, in fact, by the end of May, two main airports, Hong Kong and Shanghai, they were slightly up versus last year at the end of May. So, and one part of it is of course with a lot of the passenger aircraft either converting the PAX aircraft to a cargo carriage, or they just use the belly hold, right? Just to supplement the part of the lack of capacity. So I think freighter has an important role to play even before the pandemic, but the pandemic just really showed that to get the supply chain moving, they play a very key role.
So what do you think about so looking beyond the pandemic, what do you think, how will this kind of affect the growth of the air cargo industry? Would you be following the, let's say, how I understand Brian's position, which is quite positive?
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. I think we are very bullish on that. Few reasons, right? As Brian shared, we look at the world GDP. So even let's say that should be a softer GDP number, the demand is still there for air cargo. And if you look at some stuff like pharmaceutical, look at perishable, right? These are still, many of these items will need to be flown. And e-commerce is a huge item that, or business sector that need to be flown. And the other part why I think is bullish, if you look at the belly hold capacity that's affected, right? Say even by end of this year, the forecast is that 30% of the capacity will come back compared to pre-COVID. But 30% of that capacity, a lot will be driven by consumer. Are they comfortable flying? Right? So if you have 30% of that belly hold capacity, then the demand will still outpace what is available in the market. So I think that's one part. And when we talk about even other mode of transportation, I think the Financial Times actually has a report yesterday, right, that 20% of the seafaring or crew, they're still either stranded on the ship or they're stranded at home base because first, there's no PAX flight to bring them around the world for crew change. At the same time, they're affected by quarantine. So what happened to this? There's currently an interim solution for their regulatory staying on board the ship for beyond the 11 months. But come 16th of June, that's going to expire. What's going to happen to sea freight or the sea capacity, right? I think there's going to be an impact as well in terms of transportation.
So we actually, you too, advertised the air cargo business so well that I get questions from the students asking whether you can give them some job in the aviation industry. But I will, I will postpone that for a moment, but that's not the main issue here. So I think that is actually very interesting. So we got a few questions in the chat box besides the student asking for a job. So for instance, so that's, I think this question we have answered. So there was one question. So the aviation industry will not be a sunset industry. Will it be replaced by the other modes of transportation in the future? And I think since this is the air cargo panel, we will answer this question, for the air cargo industry. And I feel the answer based on what you have said right now is actually, no, not a sunset industry, actually quite prospering in the future. And then there's another question. Maybe I read it. There's an increasing trend that some airlines convert passenger planes temporarily to freighters, right? That's something that Alvin already mentioned, also mentioned. And since the recovery of air cargo is faster than the recovery of passenger, will such conventions still be profitable during the recovery period? So the question I feel is, will these, converted aircraft remain converted, although also in the future? So will you have more all freighter aircraft in the future than what you have right now? What do you think, Alvin?
Okay, I think the converted freighter, or so-called PAX aircraft, there are two types. One, they didn't do any conversion. It's just the regular PAX aircraft with the seat on, right? They just use the belly hole, and some of the lighter stuff. When they were shipping PPEs, you can put the light carton boxes on the seat and then with a net on top. So those are still traditional PAX aircraft. There are some airlines that went to a bit more, take a few more steps. They actually remove the seats so that they can reduce the main deck. But again, these are not delegated freighters. So in terms of the weight bearing capability of those aircraft, and also in terms of what sort of cargo they can carry, I don't think at this point it is a so-called long-term solution. And also, if you look at in terms of Brian shared earlier, right, there was a spike in terms of the pricing. So maybe that makes sense when you're using a PAX aircraft to run a cargo mission. But say rates change, you come back to a different level. I think many airlines will then look at cost and benefit, whether that still works in terms of using a PAX aircraft for cargo transportation.
I see. Okay. So then there's another question here. I think that's something. Actually, something that I feel, there is one question here highlighting that the air cargo industry was at overcapacity before the pandemic, and the question is how this is going to develop in the future. But I feel we have sort of answered the question. Of course, overcapacity would not be necessarily something good, but what you feel, or how I read what you're saying or interpreting what you're saying is that the air cargo industry will be doing fine in the future.
Yeah. Can I just jump in? So I think that's the picture that we face today and over the next couple of years. I mean, I think unless we're wrong about the profile for COVID and the recovery of the passenger side, which we think is going to be a relatively slow recovery. So that's the picture where capacity is still relatively tight in the cargo sector for the next couple of years. But I think there are still things to be worried about. And before this crisis hit us, we'd had 10 years of relatively slow growth because of protectionism. And in more recent years because of the tariff wars between the US and China. And if anything, I worry that trade relations are getting worse. I'm not sure that that's going to benefit one transport mode over another, but it would, we certainly have seen supply chains being shortened, facilities being brought close to how you said at the beginning that COVID-19 might encourage companies to continue to shorten their supply chains, which would be, that's not good news in the long term for any transport mode, including air cargo. So I think that's something for us to push back on, this growth of protectionism and aggressive tariff battles.
I think that definitely is a very good point, but I think before this is something that I think Anne has something to say about, but maybe we move first to Cliff, because the reason why I would like to do this, first I would like to apologize because I didn't really read in my introduction, I didn't read the name of the association very well, and I've looked it up. It's a Hong Kong Association of Freight Forwarding and Logistics, okay, HAFFA. Yes. And he was the immediately past chairman. Actually, he was the chairman for a long time. And I think we can be very happy to have him here because he's a clear representative on Hong Kong. And you know, when we thought about having organizing this online panel discussion, you know, we thought, okay, we don't do it. Who is going to do it? And why? Because, you know, we are our department, Department of Logistics Maritime Studies. We are part of the Hong Kong Polytechnic University. So we are here based in Hong Kong. In Hong Kong, it can be, I think, fairly be considered as the capital of air cargo worldwide. So I think for us, it's very natural to have a cargo panel discussion and host it here in Hong Kong. And Cliff knows the Hong Kong aviation, the Hong Kong air cargo business for, I don't know for how long, maybe you can tell us. And maybe you can also explain to us what the freight forwarders actually do, because maybe not everyone from the audience has a very sort of sophisticated understanding of the air cargo industry. So I think it would be good if you could explain to us what freight forwarders do, how freight forwarders experience the current situation, and how you think about the position of Hong Kong as the air cargo, sort of main air cargo hub worldwide, and how this is going to develop in the future. So a lot of questions.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Achim. Yes, I have joined the industry for more than 30 years since my graduation in the late 80s. So I'm not sure whether the audience, they know the freight forwarding industry, but I like to explain just a little, so that you have a better understanding of what a freight forwarder is doing. So a freight forwarder, I would say, it's like a middleman between shippers or importers, finding capacity, servicing, the transportation for their goods from origin to destination. So we don't own any capacity or any aircraft, or if we are a sea freight forwarder, we don't own any vessels. So what we call ourselves is a non-vessel operating common carriers, so NVOCC. And for air freight forwarders, we are like a travel agent, I would say. We work with our customer at one end, and at the other end, we work with airlines to find the capacity, to find the best routing for our customers. So, we don't own, as I said, we don't own any aircraft, any capacity, and we have to rely heavily on our partners like airlines or charter carriers or freighter operators like Atlas Air. So for the past 2 years, I would say, 2018 was a good year. And then it came to 2019. That was really a tough year for the freight forwarding industry in Hong Kong because of the China and the US trade war. And we saw a production shift from the mainland, China, to Southeast Asia or even to South Asia. And so last year, I would say, we can see a lot of freight forwarders in Hong Kong. They are having a very difficult time in fulfilling their contract with airlines. So freight forwarders, they have to rely on airlines to provide the space to carry the goods from one airport to the final destination airport. And we will work with airlines either on a soft block basis or a hard block basis. Soft block, that means, we don't buy the space. We have the cargo on hand, then we book with the carriers. But for hard block, that means, we have to sign a block space agreement, what we call BSA. So this block space agreement is can be penalized if a freight forwarder can fulfill, a monthly tonnage that is written in the contract. So last year, I can see quite a lot of forwarders in Hong Kong. They really had a difficult time to fulfill the contract. So they either have to cancel the contract or they have to negotiate the contract because of the tariff change. And also the demand has gone down. And this year, with the COVID-19 pandemic, we have a very different scenario. We have we can see a sharp drop in demand for the air cargo space, because the demand for general cargo has dropped tremendously because of the worldwide lockdown. But on the other side, like what Brian and Alvin they have just mentioned, there's also we are facing a very difficult time because of the drop in capacity. For the ocean carrier, we can see for the past few months they have already operated some blank sailings on, and I can tell from the news that quite a lot of ocean carriers, they have already extended very aggressive capacity reduction program all the way straight into the Q3. So recently, just like for example, the alliance of HAFFA, Ocean Network Express, Yangming, Hyundai, and the 2M, MSC, and Pearce, they have already announced something like 75 sailings canceled through September because of the weak demand, and also they have been facing a lot of booking cancellation by the importers or the exporters. So the ocean freight side, the capacity has been reduced, and at the same time, again, just like Brian and Alvin have mentioned, most of the airlines operated now a very skeleton passenger flight schedule. Say, for example, our home carrier, Cathay Pacific, in April, they just operate passenger flight schedule to 14 destinations only. And if you can recall, Brian also mentioned that belly hold, in fact, carries more than 50. Normally, it carries 55% of the cargo by air. So we as a forwarder, if we are looking for space, we either have to go for freighter operations, either a schedule or a charter service. And this is what we have been facing. And then because of the capacity issue, the rates also have spiked over the months. And for example, the rates from Hong Kong or even from Shanghai to Europe or to North America, they have gone up to more than 400% for the past few months.
Wow.
Yeah. Last year, I can still recall, in Hong Kong, is when we were in the slack season, it's only a single digit per kilo Hong Kong dollar. Huh? But last month, we can see, it's a triple digit. It is really gone crazy because of the capacity issue, and again, because of the urgent demand for the medical supplies, the PPE kind of shipments. So, and then with this demand and the capacity issue, I would say, most of the freight forwarders in Hong Kong, they are having a very bad time. Except those they have signed a contract with carriers because they have already locked in some protected space.
What is the share of those? Do you have some idea? Is it just 5% or is it maybe 20 or 60%?
You mean
having these locked-in tariffs?
Oh, the tariff. You mean the increase?
Yes,
the tariff. As I said, that's gone 300 or even 400 times.
Oh, yeah, I mean the freight for what is the share of the freight forwarders that benefit from their contracts and the lower rates that they have negotiated in their existing contracts?
Oh, yes. Normally, the contract has been usually done at the end of the previous year. So that most carriers, they will do the contract rates according to their forecast and the previous year market situation. So when we were in 2019, the carriers were expecting a very good 2019, quite a good year, even though there will be a trade war. But because of the historical data provided in 2018, so normally they will work out a contract rate based on that in the previous year. So for 2020, they have, most carriers, they have come across this trade war effect. So the rates are slightly lower than what we have seen in the contracts for 2019. So that's why, for those having the guts, I would say, still going for the block space agreement, for the past few months, they are doing pretty good because they have locked in the rates, and of course the extra capacity they have to sort to the market, so that will be according to the current market situation.
And these contracts are for how long? Do you do it for 1 year? Or is this the duration typically, or is it like?
It depends on the carriers that they have been working with. For some carriers, usually they have a year, a whole year contract, and they will assign certain months slack season, and then shoulder peak, and then peak rates. And for some others, some other carriers, they will have 6 months contract and then another 6 months contract.
I see. And your short view on, what is the prospect of Hong Kong as an air cargo center worldwide? For the past few weeks, I've been looking into the stats, from the Hong Kong International Airport, and again, the number of passengers handled has dropped tremendously. Just in April, the passenger handle decreases 99.5% on a year-on-year basis. As you know, because all the transit and the transfer service at Hong Kong International Airport are suspended, and non-Hong Kong residents from overseas countries, they are denied entry to Hong Kong, and also the worldwide lockdown. So that have a great impact on passenger numbers. But on the cargo side, for the first 4 months, cargo throughput just dropped, 11.7% only. And in April, again, just like what Brian has mentioned, the freighter movements at the Hong Kong International Airport, we saw a very strong growth with 24.3% on a year-on-year basis. So I would say, with the current situation, it's really hard to tell. But Hong Kong, our edge is, again, we have a free port status, and custom is very easy to go through, especially for documentation. And our edge is the agility in facilitation of charter cargo flights. As you can see, the freighter movements have increased more than 24% in April. And our airport, in Hong Kong, we still have a very extensive freighter network. And again, now airlines, they are very flexible. They are, using passenger aircraft for all cargo operation as well. So I'm still very optimistic that, with the position of Hong Kong as a cargo, air cargo hub in Asia, the pandemic, I would say, it's only having a short-term impact. Good. Yeah. Thank you. So these are good news for our students who are looking for a job. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. So now I asked actually Alvin, what is Atlas Air doing? I asked Cliff, what are freight forwarders doing? Now I could ask Anne, what are academics doing? But I don't want to be going into those details, but rather my question would be, because you are in logistics and supply chain management doing research. So my little bit, my question would be, do you feel that supply chain managers have been a little bit too naive in the past and too reluctant to ensure that they maintain sufficiently resilient supply chains so that they couldn't respond to the current, that they weren't very well prepared for the current situation? What do you think?
Well, nobody had expected a downturn or a change in the situation as it actually came up. But I think they were actually prepared better than they would have been, say, 15, 20 years ago. We've had sufficient events in the past, Fukushima, Thailand floods, those type of things, that have taught supply chain managers well that they need to take care of their supply chains, that they need to make sure their supply chains become more resilient, that changes are implemented early on. Transparency has increased. They may not know perfectly what's happening in the supply chains, but they certainly know more than they had in the past. So from that perspective, I think we were in a way kind of lucky that this pandemic hit us now, when companies had the potential to change their operations before. But as Brian already commented, supply chains have been modified somewhat. There is a trend to shorten supply chains, but they're still incredibly long and complex. So, and the answer probably is not to put everything next door to each other. This is not the way our world works nowadays, but they have learned to build supply chains that are less complex, that they can manage better in a way. Still ways to go.
So do you think that the air cargo businesses lives, of course, by flying things from one place to the other. So if a resilient global value, Brian and also Alvin and everyone sort of highlighted the relevance of global value chains and also e-commerce. And so all of this depends on sort of, okay, so you're flying things from one place to the other. Now the question is, if you want to strive for a more resilient global supply chain, would that necessarily mean that you would become more localized? What do you think about that?
I don't think it's about being more localized. It's about being, in a way, more redundant without creating a huge amount of overcapacity. So sure, there is no point in flying certain things around the world a couple of times unless there's a huge cost benefit. And we do have the cost benefit across different countries in the world. But we can think about how to position things smartly. Say, how can we do ideas like postponement that we've seen that hasn't, I mean, that's been around for 40 years now. The idea, when do you need to decide on when to finalize your products to the exact demand in the market? So if these type of ideas can be implemented quite nicely to exploit, on the one hand, that you have a cost benefit when you produce in certain countries, and bring things closer to markets and actually finalize close to the end customer. So those type of stories can be easily played and are used by companies to make supply chains maybe not shorter, but better prepared for the short-term changes that may come up. So it's not necessarily about super short supply chains, it's about supply chains that you can manage well. And we will always, supply chain managers will never decide for a fully resilient supply chain if it doesn't pay off, right? Mm-hmm. It's about having revenues at the end of the year.
Yeah. So I was actually, when I was looking at there are some maps by this World Bank report where they show the involvement in of the different regions in the global value chain. And then you could see basically all the regions are involved in the global value chain, but in different ways. For instance, North America, China, and other parts of Asia, of course, Japan, and Europe are more like the high-tech industries, while, for instance, Africa is more sort of commodities. And in these situations, when you're talking about supply chains, maybe those regions are not yet so much involved. But if you come up with more, what I would think, if you could come up with more free trade agreements, more integrating the developing parts of the world, such as Africa, that could also help actually coming up with more resilient global value chains, because you're making a better use of the world geography in a way. And this leads me to one point where I think these parts of the world actually are part of this Belt and Road Initiative. So I was wondering whether perhaps the Belt and Road Initiative could be contributing to a more resilient global value chain. But that's bringing a couple of, this is what I really like about the air cargo topic, because it's very exciting. You have the air cargo, you have the global value chain, you have all these e-commerce, you have this like a really global phenomenon, and then you have these different initiatives coming together. But I really think the question is, do you think that Africa could be part of a more resilient global supply chain in the future? Difficult question, I think.
Yeah, difficult. Well, from the world as we see it today, the majority of Africa is not participating in global value chains as many other parts of the world. But looking back at how things have changed in certain regions of Asia over the last years, we may well see changes in Africa as well. So it will all depend on how the economy develops, also on the political situation in many of the African countries. I'm not the one to make a forecast here. Let's push that to Brian potentially for economists.
I was wondering about Brian's opinion. What do you think about the future of air cargo or aviation in Africa?
Well, actually, you're quite right, Anne, that I don't think we see Africa really participating to any great extent in global value chains. But with horticulture, with fresh produce, with flowers, a high proportion of Europe's consumption of those goods comes from Africa. Kenya's, there are lots of jobs being supported in the horticultural sector in Africa and other countries by rapid air transport services supplying consumers in Europe. So, air cargo is pretty important at the moment for living standards in parts of Africa. Yes, I mean, will Africa participate in global value chains? I don't know. I think there's certainly the potential, and we've seen, obviously, economic growth and development has been very patchy across Africa, but we've seen a number of economies doing really well in recent years. I think the trouble is, though, I think that the Covid-19 is going to adversely affect Africa more than many continents because of its dependence on commodities and perhaps the lack of resource of many of the governments to deal with the situation. So I do worry about the emerging market crises that is likely to come out of this current situation. But longer term, air cargo is really important. I mean, air cargo is obviously important for Africa because other transport modes are quite difficult as well.
Sure, please.
Let me add to that point of Brian. I think the point of other modes of transport is a very important point there because, well, Africa is basically served, at least connecting to Europe or to North America, by air cargo. And this is different in comparison to if you think of Europe and Asia connections, where you have other modes of transport that can also be used. And in terms of supply chain resilience, that's an important point. As you don't want to rely on certain countries or certain suppliers to have a resilient supply chain, on the other, you don't want to rely on a single mode of transport either, if possible. You need to have a backup plan. Europe has seen that with the Iceland volcano some years back. And everyone has understood that there needs to be a backup and that other modes of transport need to be at least available in comparison to air cargo if you want to build resilient supply chains. So this may be just an add-on because for Africa, it would basically be ocean carriers that can buffer up, and substituting ocean by air or the other way around is not obvious.
Yeah, that's right. So actually, just before, a couple of hours before this session started, Cathay Pacific has announced that there is the following, a few hours ago, that there will be provided with this Hong Kong dollar 7.8 billion bridge loan to Cathay Pacific from the Hong Kong government. So then the question, which I think is definitely something that no one would question, that an action like this would be is justified. But do you think that, for instance, given the difference between how the businesses for cargo and combined carriers work, do you think such bailouts or loans would be justified also for cargo in the cargo business, for cargo freighters or freight forwarders?
Maybe I can jump in here.
Excuse me?
Turkey.
Yeah, Elwood. Yeah, maybe if you have some views on this.
Yeah, so you're right. You know, the Hong Kong government just announced a big loan to Cathay, and actually we've seen that for various airlines, right, including, for example, Lufthansa, more than 10 billion as well. But I think that goes to show one important part is that aviation industry is an important source of employment, right? I mean, if you look at Hong Kong itself, why the government has done that, it is 330,000 jobs that the industry is supporting. So I think if you look around the world, that is what is happening. You know, besides what we initially or in the beginning mentioned about the important role of that air freight or air capacity in global supply chain. So I think that's one key factor why many governments actually step in to help. And a lot of this, if you look at investment in aircraft, like earlier Cliff mentioned about looking at capacity on an annual basis, 2-yearly basis, but when an airline actually commits to buying an aircraft, it's for the next 10, 15, 20 years. You have to do that forecast to commit to that sort of investment. So I think that's the situation for many of the different
do you think we also, and actually Hong Kong has another sort of feature, and this is their efforts to support and boost the aircraft financing and leasing industry. Do you feel that a more flexible air cargo business should be making use of more lease, or more, you know, should you own the aircraft or lease the aircraft, or how does the aircraft leasing business sort of help you, you know, could help you perhaps managing such situations better?
That really depends on the, I think, individual company, right? You have to assess if there's a new carrier, maybe just starting to do freighter, for example, that they may say, okay, maybe may give us a bit more flexibility if I do a leasing option, I may be able to change. Or if someone who's already flying, they may look at supplementing their capacity. They may not even lease. They may look at what we call wet lease, where someone is flying part of the network for you. So I think there's no one answer to that. It really depends on the requirement of each individual airline or customer.
Cliff, what do you think about financial support for freight forwarders?
Yeah, for freight forwarders in Hong Kong, I think we roughly have over 3,000 freight forwarders companies in Hong Kong. Most of them, they are SMEs, and they roughly employ something like 230,000 people in the industry. And then for forwarders, as I said, we are quite asset light, in the sense that we don't own the capacity. Some of them, they just have to rent, office and warehouse. So the major cost for freight forwarders, it's rental for office and warehouse, and it will account for around 60% of the total cost. So financing is, finance is really a tough issue now, because the majority of the forwarders in Hong Kong, as I said, they are SME, and they are having very tight cash flows. Normally, I would say 2 to 3 months. And just say just take an example. If you want to do a charter, for a 747 freighter, normally it will cost you a few million Hong Kong dollars. And if you are talking about extra volume, maybe you need to charter more than one freighter, maybe ongoing, maybe every week you need to go for 1 or 2 freighter operations. We are talking about more than 10 million there. So we have been also, the industry have been talking to the government on, especially now we have this pandemic issue, talking about how they can help the industry on the rental part. But up to this moment, we haven't seen any concrete reply from the government. So yes, I think the finance issue is really really a tough one to deal with, especially now. We can see coming into June, we can see a lot of countries, they are opening up gradually. So the PPE kind of shipment, the demand for that kind of shipment will not be as strong as for the past few months. So what if all the shops, retail shops, they are open and the demand is growing? I would say our industry, the freight forwarders will, I think, they can survive because the demand will be coming back slowly. But what if the demand is not there, and the only what we can see is the only kind of shipments that are being sent by air are mostly PPE and also e-commerce cargo. So without these two supporting pillars, we will be also in a very difficult time for the coming months.
Actually, there was one question here in the chat box talking about the kind of, what is the shape of the recovery that we are expecting? And I think what you're saying is, well, if we have more like a V-shaped recovery, which we actually see right now in a lot of the stock markets, a little bit surprisingly, I would say, for some of us. But we actually, now the question is, do we see like a V-shaped recovery which would sort of be in support of the freight forwarders and would help mitigating, of course, their position or their problems? And I think, what would you think? That would be one question that has been raised here in the chat box. But I still would like to see whether what Brian thinks when you talk about financial support for airlines. Do you distinguish between combined carriers or combination carriers or all freight carriers, or is there, how do you have any thoughts on this?
Well, often government support has been, obviously there have been some targeted bailouts, some targeted support, but a large part of the support from government has been wage subsidies, which have been obviously available for everybody, or the support from central banks and governments on debt. So I haven't really, I don't think we've seen much of a distinction between the cargo and the passenger business. I mean, what I would say though is that the loan for Cathay is debt. Once Cathay and others start to trade again, they're going to have to meet those fixed obligations to service that debt and repay it. Airlines are going to come out of this crisis into the recovery period with a very large debt burden. That's going to be a big challenge, I think, for successful operations. And so it will depend on the strength of the recovery as to whether they can survive. And I think that V-shaped recovery question, I think, is quite an important one. I think for the passenger business, we've decided it won't happen, partly because air travel would depend on borders being opened and travel restrictions being reduced, and that's likely to be very slow, particularly on international markets. But actually, I think for the cargo business, particularly with businesses restocking the global supply chains, global value chains, I think that will generate, a V-shaped recovery. I think cargo's in a reasonably good position. It typically does do well at the start of economic recoveries, and if we do see economies unlock and people return to work and manufacturing typically starts up first, I think we will see quite a strong recovery in demand. I remember in the global financial crisis, we were caught out. Everyone was talking about L-shaped recoveries, and in the event, we saw a very strong recovery in the cargo sector.
Yeah, this is so amazing, right? I mean, yeah. So when you're saying that the air cargo flights are still going, but how about, I think this is like operational detail, which I think is quite interesting though. How about the self-quarantine? How do you manage the crews, Alvin? Because if they have to they're coming to Hong Kong, 2 weeks of self-quarantine, and then they go somewhere else, 2 weeks of how can you manage?
I think one key point is being very flexible and nimble to look at the changing situation. So and the good thing is that actually many authorities around the world has very clear definition, right? If they are deemed as essential workers, what sort of quarantine regime they will go through. I think that has been key in making sure that the global supply chain continue to flow. So I think that's the key part. And I certainly hope or believe what Brian mentioned about sharp recovery. And I think one aspect of why we are also positive is e-commerce, right? We talk about e-commerce, and if you look at today, about 15% of everything on sales is done through e-commerce. And actually 50% or more of that, they are actually streaming medias, the videos, the music, the books that we are looking. So if you look at the upside, it's huge. And what this pandemic actually changed as well, it has more convert into e-commerce, right? Because in the past, you may do it as a convenience, but during the pandemic, it became essential and required even for food e-commerce. So I think if you look at the US for Walmart, it was about 16% before for food e-commerce, and now it's about 40%. So likewise in China, which was already huge in terms of e-commerce shopping or online. If you look at every year for Singles Day, just continue to break record every year, right? So I think that is a push, and what e-commerce actually changed is also more things actually flown. Some things that we buy, they may be small items. In the past, they'll be shipped by a huge container, pushed forward to these, closer to the market, a fulfillment center, and eventually got sent out to the shops. But with e-commerce, that actually changed when you buy, especially when it's C2C. Someone is packing, and he may be a Taobao, he may be on a shop in China, packing into a SF courier package, a DHL package, and sent across the world. So I think that is also another driver of growth for air cargo.
Actually, this is a direct question to one of the participants who was asking, what other factors led to speculation of air cargo will recover? And I think e-commerce, so what you just mentioned, the whole story is an excellent question to this, answer to this question. There's another one, I think, for Cliff, and this is risk sharing. Mm-hmm. So you mentioned these contracts, right? So you have the negotiated rates, but then the environment has changed very dramatically. And right. I think this is, if anything, this is an underrepresentation of what's happening right now. So is there some flexibility in the contracts? Does it depend on, for instance, the size of the partners and negotiation power? Mm-hmm. What any thoughts on this?
Yes, I have gone through many times with this BSA, on hand, but we have difficult time in fulfilling, the tonnage that we have committed. So in most cases, we forwarders work with carriers. We are like partners that. On a weekly basis, we will communicate with each other, and the carriers on the airline side, they will also know the market situation. So last year in 2019, we had the trade war. So a lot of forwarders, they have concluded the contract by the end of 2018 already. But when it came to the end of the first quarter, everybody was seeing a very different picture, that the demand has dropped, tremendously. And normally we will have a shoulder peak right before the Easter season. And last year, we didn't see a very strong growth in demand for that kind of urgent shipments for Easter peak. And then when it came to the normal peak time period, September, October, the industry again hardest hit by the local protest. And then why it affected the air cargo as well, because of the border check. There are many items considered as sensitive items. So torch, backpacks, black t-shirts, etc. Even though they are for brand names or whatever, you got caught at the border, and it will take weeks whether you can get through. So a lot of importers last year, they will change the terms from FOB Hong Kong to FOB Guangzhou or Shenzhen, in order to avoid the further delay. So last year, when it came to the peak time in September, October, the normal goods, the more normal volume that we could handle were gone. So, the carriers, they know the situation. So normally they will work together with the forwarder to see how we can do it. Either we really have to lower the volume that we have committed, or they will have extension of for another few more months for you to catch up the shortfall. Mm. And in money terms, in rate, in terms of rate, they will also offer some flexibility. They will also have taking into account the market situation, the market rate from competitors. Like those, say for example, Cathay, they will take into consideration what Alvin's company has been doing on the rates, and all the other Asian carriers have been doing on the rates, and then they will adjust accordingly, but not to a certain extent. But they will offer some flexibility so that we can still, for the forwarders, they can still fulfill the contract.
I see. So there is some flexibility because you have also these long-term sort of established relationships, and you understand that you are together sort of, this is supply chain, right? And you have different partners, and only together you can provide the service. So you have to sort of collaborate and have some flexibility in order to go through those different through these times. And I think this is what's happening, this is what you're showing, and makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, precisely. For certain, for every carrier, they have already a number of supporting agents that have been working with them for years. So this is really a kind of long-term partnership. So they don't look at a very short-term kind of just win and get out, but they want a long-term partnership.
Yeah, and you also sort of mentioned how the difficulties with these items that you needed to from the mainland coming to Hong Kong, you have this additional checking, and how this has sort of made the situation for the air cargo business and freight forwarders in Hong Kong more complicated. I think that's also addressing one of the questions from the audience. Another is, and this is definitely a very important topic, is the Greater Bay Area. And here, I think that's something to always keep in mind. For me, I'm a European, and we always, we have so many small countries and relatively small populations. I don't know, Anne, you are in Luxembourg. How many Luxembourg, this is a country, Luxembourg. How many people live in Luxembourg?
Live in Luxembourg a little over 500,000. Don't care the exact number.
So we have this one area here called, it's a new developed area. If I turn around, there we have a lot of high-rise building. One of the high-rise building around 2,500 people. And then, this just really, well, it's basically the almost the whole population of Luxembourg. And so the Greater Bay Area, actually, the population of the Greater Bay Area, including Guangzhou, of course, Hong Kong, Guangzhou, Shenzhen, and so on and so forth, is actually bigger than the UK. And then the question is, so we are talking about some very sizable and a very dynamic, definitely a very dynamic place. And I'm always making fun of some of my Hong Kong, friends, when they think about Hong Kong as basically a small city with like 7.5 million, a population of 7.5 million, but which is for me, we have I'm coming from the capital of Germany, and we have 3.5 million in Berlin, which is the biggest city in Germany, which is really not very big. But then if you just walk a little bit across the border, there's Shenzhen at 12 million, right? Or Guangzhou, I don't know. So the real big cities. And then the question emerges, okay, so how does Hong Kong sort of an air cargo business in Hong Kong, what's the position in this Greater Bay Area sort of market? So I think, Cliff, you already mentioned the free port status and the sort of superior efficiency in handling air cargo. Is there anything else that you would like to add to this?
Yeah, we are more into now, the higher value end of, cargo. So that's why, we are looking, China, the one from Alibaba, they have already a plan, setting up their hub at the airport. So there's also, why the HKIA, they are awarding this piece of land to China is because that will be more on their high value chain. So for the Greater Bay Area, I would say, the forwarders in Hong Kong, they are already having a footstep in the area due to the CEPA arrangement. So a lot of forwarders in Hong Kong, they have applied their license to operate set up their own offices, their branch offices across the border already. So normally now, the forwarders in Hong Kong, they will have branch office across the border, so that we have a kind of a division of labor. Say for example, Hong Kong, for the office in Hong Kong, we normally will handle the more time sensitive one, higher value one. And the rest, we can use our Shenzhen office or our office in Guangzhou for those customers. They are looking for cheaper solutions or a slightly longer transit time. So we have already a division of labor. So the more high-end type, for the past few years, e-commerce or all the high-end electronic stuff, they all contain mostly, they contain batteries, lithium batteries.
Yeah, dangerous goods, right?
Yes, yes, power banks or pure lithium batteries. Hong Kong, we are able to handle. Although some carriers they don't accept this kind of pure battery or power bank type of shipments. But for some freighter or cargo freighter operators, they can accept. And the documentation for those DG is easier in Hong Kong than on the mainland. So a lot of customers, shippers, they would prefer to send these cargoes via Hong Kong to overseas. even though maybe our freight cost will be slightly higher than those from the mainland, but they still prefer to use Hong Kong.
Okay, so we have now around 5 minutes left, and there is one important question also still remaining in the chat box. Maybe some others are coming up, and this is about sustainability. So my question would be, what do you think about the future of, let's say, global value chains and air cargo businesses? Do you think that will be greener than what we have right now? And how do you think about the environmental effect of the air cargo businesses and of the future of the industry, and how it will contribute to a sort of more sustainable and greener world? That's a big question, of course, yeah. To the end. So what do you think about that, Brian?
Yeah. Well, I mean, air miles has been an issue in certain European countries. You know, consumers have sort of looked at how far. I can't hear you very well.
Maybe you can come a little bit closer.
Air miles have been an issue in a number of European countries, and consumers, you know, have looked at how far their products have flown, which obviously seems at first to be a negative factor for air cargo. But I mean, I mentioned the Kenyan horticulture and flower industry. You know, actually, I think what's important is to take an end-to-end view of carbon emissions, because, you know, many of the flowers that are grown in Europe, in Amsterdam, for instance, you know, in heated greenhouses, actually it turns out that even taking into account the air transport emissions, it's you know, there's less climate impact flying produce from Africa. So I think we do need to take a broader perspective on this. But clearly, you know, environment, I think climate change is an issue that's not going to disappear because of the COVID crisis and subsequent recession. I think it is going to be one of those really important license to operate issues that the industry's got to be seen to be addressing appropriately.
I see. I really think this is something complex to consider the end-to-end. It's more sort of easier, right, to just look at, okay, so we are thinking about air cargo and we just assess this on this particular issue and we forget all the rest. But I fully agree as economist, you know, you really have to take it all into account, end-to-end, and then you have to make an assessment. I think you have some, you know, greener and more sustainable global supply chains. What do you think?
Well, it's certainly necessary, and I'm with Brian fully on we need to look at the full perspective of the total outcome of supply chains. Maybe a point to add there is also, well, the air cargo industry or any logistics industry always has an interest in making sure that whatever input they have into their processes, be it fuel, is efficiently used. So if we can avoid empty capacity flying around or being driven around in trucks, that's a major impact. And we still get the products we want to have. And then it's like the next step needs to be, how can we make more efficient trucks, more efficient aircraft? But the industry is on it anyways, because it's a major input cost into their operations. So maybe the consumer question then is, do we need to have strawberries at moments when there is definitely no season where we live? But this is probably for the people, for the consumers to decide at some point. But this is not going to be the game changer for air cargo. There's more need for air cargo than just because some people want specific fruit at specific times of the year.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. Alvin, how about you? What do you think? What is the company policy, so to say? Or, you know, how are your view on the environmental contribution of the air cargo industry?
So as Adam mentioned, you know, we certainly believe that being green is also good for business. Fuel is definitely a big portion of the operating costs, and we look at different aspects of the operation, right? Whether when we land, when you're doing a taxi at the runway, do you switch on all 4 engines, or, you know, maybe you can run with 2 different sort of which flight path or navigation path to do. So we go to talk to authorities, to different flight control, air traffic control, to get the best or most efficient routing. And generally as well, if you invest in newer aircraft, so each generation of newer aircraft would usually be 15 to 20% more efficient than the previous generation. So I think those are also helping, and we participate actively in the ICAO carbon offsetting and reduction. So we are very mindful about the impact on the environment for sure. But as Anna rightly mentioned, doing the right thing as well is good for business.
Thank you. So I think we have to close the session right now. I would very much like to thank the panelists for their contributions. I think that has been extremely insightful. I learned a lot, and I hope the audience agrees to this, and I believe they will agree with this. I also want to thank the audience actually for really contributing to this debate with all their questions, which were excellent. And I think the lesson I learned is actually a positive one. We will have a good air cargo business industry in the future, and also an industry that is taking, trying to make their contribution, or makes the contribution to a more sustainable and greener world, so to say. So thank you very much. I will close the session right now. We stop the recording, and for those